Welcome to the third episode of Pondering the Orb. I'm your host, the wandering author J. Requard. Once again, we're here to talk about books, music, and more. The filming for the content presented here was taken at ConCarolinas 2022 in Charlotte, North Carolina. I would like to thank the organizers, authors, readers, fans, and family who attended this event and made it the wonderful time that it was. It's obvious this show is always an experiment. Instead of our usual book segment, we're going to play Authors Answer the Internet, based off the card game Answer the Internet with some of the great authors I attended ConCarolinas with. As always, please check out the links in the description to these authors and their books.
Lucy, can you introduce yourself and tell us about your book?
Sure. My name is Lucy Blue, and my book is The Devil Makes Three. It is a Southern Gothic horror novel set in a small town in South Carolina. There was an axe murder in 1837 at a plantation where the daughter's fiance axe murdered the entire family. The plantation has been empty, deserted since then, held in trust by this group of people in this small town, and now a famous horror author, kind of a combination of Stephen King, Neil Gaiman kind of guy, has bought it to write a book there, and all the ghosts are coming out.
Very neat. So I've invited you here today to do Authors Answer the Internet. I'm going to ask you 3 questions from the internet. Just try to answer them as honestly as you can. Some might be a little inappropriate. Always feel free to say pass if you want to answer. So the first question, Lucy Blue, answer the internet. If you could live anyone else's life with anyone's body,
Wow, that's a good one. Is this someone who is alive today?
alive or dead?
Alive or dead. Okay. I would probably want to live Jane Austen's life in her body, but only briefly, not for the rest of her life.
Right.
But I would love to have a chance to just experience her brain, the way that she perceived everything around her. And it's really funny that came to mind because usually I'm not a Regency person, but I just think that she would be fun.
That's a fantastic answer. She would be really good. Okay, here's an interesting one. Lucy Blue, answer the internet. If you could die and come back as any inanimate object, what would it be?
Oh, let's see. Brendan Fraser Parkland. If I could come back as an inanimate object, it would probably be like a really well-loved toy.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah. Okay, Lucy Blue, your final question. Debate the internet. What are your guilty pleasure movies?
Guilty pleasure movies. I actually talked about one in a panel earlier. Queen of the Damned.
Oh, great film.
It is a great film. It is a great film. It's uneven. You can tell that things went wrong. They had to piece it together. But they did such a beautiful job. And, okay, does it follow the book? No, it does not. It's a completely different thing. But it's beautifully cast, and it does some stuff with the vampire idea that nobody had ever done before in a movie. And so, yeah, I love it.
Fantastic answer, Lucy Blue. Thank you for answering
Thank
the internet.
you, Jim.
One more time, can you tell us about your book?
My book is The Devil Makes Three. It is available in hardcover and softcover right now, and will be available in audiobook in the next couple of months.
Excellent. Today I'm here with Dan Jolley. Dan, can you tell us about yourself and your book, please?
Sure thing. My name is Dan Jolley. I've been writing professionally for like 3 decades now. Started out in comic books, working for Marvel and DC and Dark Horse and pretty much all the other major ones in the country. Got into novels, licensed property novels, original novels, novelizations. Got into writing for video games. I've done a tiny little bit of screenwriting.
Yeah.
My latest book is the RUNEMASTER HOMICIDE, which is my first ever fantasy novel. And because I can't make things easy on myself, it's a mixed genre book. It's a high fantasy detective hybrid. It's an original setting. It's about an all-human empire that's used rune-based magic to solve crimes for like 300 years. Well, something begins to deteriorate that magic and then falls to the first non-human member of the Imperial Criminal Investigation Ministry to introduce actual detective procedures for the first time in like 12 generations, so they can try to figure out what's going on, maybe keep the empire from crumbling.
That's fantastic. Well, I brought you here today to ask ask you 3 questions from the internet and get your response to them.
Yes, yes.
So we'll start with this. Answer the internet. Which reality TV show would you be best on?
Oh, God. Not any of the ones where you have to run around the French countryside counting grapes in vineyards. I don't know. Maybe Big Brother.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. Best is relative. I get voted out really quick.
Answer the internet. Top place you don't want to get caught for public urination. For example, Vatican. You don't want to get caught there.
Oh, let's see. Maybe the Lucasfilm campus.
Ooh, that'd be interesting. Just in terms of the response I gave you. Okay, answer the internet, and I think this is a good one for you. How many TV shows have you seen that you could take a college course on and get an A?
Oh, let's see. That would be the ones that I've watched over and over again. So I guess number 1, probably Scrubs.
Yeah?
Yeah, I watched Scrubs. Oh, and that 70s show.
Yeah.
I've seen that 70s show like 8 times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on Answer the Internet and Pondering the Orb. Once again, tell us about your book.
It is my first ever fantasy novel. It's a fantasy detective hybrid.
Excellent.
It stars a 6'3", purple-skinned, yellow-eyed, horned female character named Niska Stonegate.
You're selling the hell out of this book. Tamsin, will you please tell us about your book today?
Yeah, I wrote The Cursed Ability Kid in the Untold Legends series. It is about, I actually took real history from Billy the Kid. I studied for 5 years with historians, so that it's the real history, and then I wrapped it in Irish folklore.
Fantastic.
So that's the short pitch.
Okay, so today I'm going to ask you 3 questions from the internet.
Okay.
Answer them to the best of your ability, and if you want to skip one, just tell me.
Okay.
We're going to do 3 of these. Okay, first question. Tamsin Silver, please answer the internet. Would you rather have your own personal bathroom or own personal office?
Own personal bathroom. I have a roommate. There's no way in hell I want to share a bathroom with him.
Answer the internet. If the Purge was real, what would you be doing?
Purge was real. Remind me, I haven't seen that.
The Purge is that movie where they America decides like one day a year they're just going to have rapid violence where you can murder anyone you want and no one's going to arrest you for it. What would you be doing?
Presidential, yeah, moving on.
Yeah. Okay, here's good. Answer the internet. You get to choose between a sum of money or world peace. How much money would it take for you to give up world peace? Answer the internet, Tamsin. Answer the internet, Tamsin.
$500 billion.
Ooh, that's a good number.
I'm
Good.
just saying.
Yeah.
Because with that amount of money, I probably can make world peace happen. In theory.
In theory.
Everything works.
Tamsin, thank you so much for playing Answer the Internet.
You bet.
Would you like to tell us about your book one more time?
Yes, if you are a fan of Billy the Kid, this is the book for you. If you love historical fantasy, if you love a great adventure, this is something you'll really enjoy. And if you've ever seen the movie with Billy the Kid, the one everybody loves so much, it's very similar to that. It's just got the history right, and we've thrown in some magic.
Excellent. Sarah, please introduce yourself and your book.
Hi, I'm Sarah J. Sover. I'm the author of Fairy Godmurder, which just released from Falstaff Books. It's about a fairy godmother who goes rogue to hunt down the bastard who offed her first princess.
Fantastic. So I've invited you here today to answer 3 questions from the internet. If you feel like you don't want to answer a question, just say skip, but just give your best honest answer. Sarah J. Sover, debate the internet. What fictional TV or movie character would you love to beat the shit out of?
Oh no. So many. Told you I'm not good on the spot.
Yes, we can edit. Yes, we can edit down.
I can't even think of a show right now. Like, I just don't do,
That's
I
okay.
told you. Dirt.
Okay, answer the internet. What would your awkward Jeopardy interview story be?
Probably something very much like this, where I'm asked questions out of nowhere and I have no idea. I have very bad ADHD.
Right.
And so my brain is going 50 million directions at once, and if you put me on the spot, it goes.
Gotcha.
So yeah, this. What is this?
What is this? Well, I'll skip this next question. What's the most awkward social? Answer the internet. If you were in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, what would you do to get kicked out?
I'd definitely be flying up on the ceiling.
Fantastic. One last question. Debate the internet. If you could have any fictional dog as your pet, who would it be?
Probably Beethoven.
Yeah. Fantastic.
I'd end up drenched all the time, but it'd be totally worth it.
Yeah, just big lovable dog.
Yes, big lovable
Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. Tell us about your book one last time.
Fairy godmother, fairy godmother with a vendetta and a killer pair of dogs.
Richard, could you please introduce yourself and introduce your book?
Hi, I'm Richard Fife. I am a enjoyer of multi-scotches, a liver by the sea that never goes there, and also a devourer of the patriarchy. My novel, Conflict Born, is a gaslamp fantasy, so think steampunky zero-G sky pirates. Sweet. I think so, but I'm biased.
So, I've invited you here today to answer 3 questions from the internet. Richard Fife, debate the internet. Who would be your #1 butler/chef to have from any movie or TV show?
I like the original Alfred from the Michael Keaton Batmans, and also like all of them quite a bit after that. He's the former Secret Service, was able to take care of things and keep Master Bruce from being too beat up.
Yeah, always had dinner ready.
Always had dinner ready, and also was willing to tell him when he was being an idiot.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, debate the internet. Could the U.S. military infiltrate Hogwarts?
Could the U.S. military infiltrate Hogwarts? I am going to say they could, but they're going to get in there, not realize quite where they are, get lost, leave, and then it's going to be put into a file that no one's going to ever read.
That's probably the case. Debate the internet. Who is the best fictional cop partner?
Best fictional cop partner.
Examples could be Ooch, Turner, and
Yeah.
Ooch.
I'm going to say Amy from Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Yeah, excellent.
Because she's smart, and she's going to keep me out of trouble and call me on my bullshit.
Fantastic. Richard, one more time, will you tell us about your book?
This is Conflict Born. It is zero-G steampunky sky pirates and a captain who just can't catch a break as she is constantly being chased from one spot to another and having to accept the help of a shady noblewoman to keep going.
I have Samantha Bryant. Samantha, will you tell us about yourself and your book?
So hi, I'm Samantha Bryant. I write the Menopausal Superhero Series, which, as it sounds, is a superhero series where the people getting powers are women of a certain age, to put it politely. And about me, I am a person who came late to writing in life. I started when I was 42 because that's the meaning of life, the universe, and everything, so it's time. And I write superhero, and I also write short horror, and other than that, I walk in the woods and like mushrooms.
Oh, that's fantastic. Woods and mushrooms are wonderful.
They are.
So I'm going to ask you 3 questions from the internet.
Okay.
Once again, if you find any of these inappropriate, we can skip.
I used to teach middle school.
Oh, well.
I'm hard to shock.
Samantha Bryant, answer the internet. Would you miss the final season of your favorite TV show? You never even get to know how it ended to get your favorite sports team into a championship.
No, I don't do sports.
Okay, good answer.
Yeah.
Follow-up. Answer the internet. What's the most rewatchable TV show of all time?
I'm gonna go with Firefly.
Oh, okay.
I watch it every time that I'm sick, and I'm gonna have to be still for enough hours, and it's wonderful every time.
I just found this question. We're going to ask it. Answer the internet. There's a full-grown lion and 30 little people in a battle royal.
30 little people?
Little people. Who
Okay.
wins?
One lion, 30 little people. I'm gonna go with the little people because they can be vicious one-on-one, but with 30, if they can work together,
Yeah.
yeah, they can take down anything.
That lion has no shot.
Yeah.
Samantha, Bryant, thank you so much for joining us for Authors Answer the Internet. If you could tell us about your book one more time.
So this is book one, Going Through the Change. The series is called the Menopausal Superhero Series, and it is dramedy in tone, so comedy in moments, but also a lot about women's friendship and the meaning of heroism.
Perfect. Patrick Dugan, will you please introduce your book and then we'll play?
Hi, I'm Patrick Dugan. This is Stormforged. It's the first book in the Dark Storm trilogy. It won the Imaginarium Award for Best Indie Sci-Fi in 2019. So it is my indie. It was my first one, and I'm very proud of it.
Excellent. Thank you for being with us
Oh,
today.
thanks for having me.
I'm going to ask you 3 questions from the internet.
Okay.
If you wish to answer them, of course, answer them the best you can. If we need to skip, we'll skip. Philosophy question. Debate the internet, Patrick. If you found out your life was the Truman Show, what would be your most proud moment about that people saw? What would you be most embarrassed about?
Oh, that's a tough one. Most proud it would be my kids.
Yeah.
They're just amazing. Just watching them grow up and become like fully functioning adults. Probably my low point would be going through my divorce, because that was not pleasant.
Answer the internet. If you could train a pet bird to do anything you want, and it would always return home, what would you train that pet bird to do?
Give me a beer.
Oh, fantastic answer.
That's an easy one.
Yeah. Last question. If you could open up a school of life to learn real-life valuable things, what would you teach?
Well, I already teach writing.
Yeah.
So I think I would teach technology. So especially in underserved communities, I'm a computer programmer by day. That's my day job. So there's a lot of really good paying jobs, especially for like single moms, and those jobs are never available to them because they don't have an avenue to get their skills to the point where they can hold down those jobs. Because that makes a huge difference going from working at a McDonald's to a $50,000 or $60,000 a year job is life changing for people. And so that is actually one of the things when I retire that I want to start doing is teaching people how to do those jobs, because there's so much demand for it. There's not enough people already. So it's just I think it just would help so many people. And that is a one-on-one that you can actually do something for somebody and then they reap the rewards and you just feel good about it.
Excellent. Patrick, thank you for playing Authors
Oh,
Answer the
thank
Internet.
you.
One more time, what's your book?
It's Stormforged. It's from Falstaff Books, and it's available on Amazon, and it's also on Audible.
With me, I have Rachel Brune. Rachel, please introduce yourself and your book.
Absolutely. So my name is Rachel Brune, and I am a writer of speculative fiction, usually on the darker side, so horror, dark fantasy, things like that. I'm also the founder and editor of CRONE Girls Press. We're an indie horror micro press specializing in horror anthologies. So short stories. I tell people, pick up one of our anthologies, find your new favorite horror author. On my own, I'm also a fan of the short story, and this book, Side Rose, is a collection of short stories. Some of them have been published in other markets. Some of them were part of an October challenge that I did. Lynn Hansen did an art challenge. I was like, oh, I'll write flash fiction.
Yes.
I didn't do all of them, but I did some of them, and some of them are in this book. And then there's 2 brand new stories that aren't anywhere else except in this book.
Very cool. Go check those out for those exclusives. Rachel, I brought you here to answer the internet, so let's begin. Rachel, Brune, please debate the internet. Which TV character most represents you?
Oh, geez. Well, that is a good question. But I will say that when I was growing up, I was a big Trek fan, especially original Trek. And although I was from New Jersey, the grumpy Southern character of Dr. McCoy was definitely someone that I felt some connection with.
Fantastic. Rachel Brune, please debate the internet. If you had to pick any 6 people for a season of reality TV, who would it be?
6 people.
6 people.
Okay. Well, my brother Chris,
Okay.
who's continually inappropriate at all times, but funny when
Yes.
he's inappropriate. I would probably pick. I would bring Ruth Bader Ginsburg back to life,
Yes.
and I would also pick her. I'd like to mix it up with maybe some sports people, so Mia Hamm, I think would be like super fun,
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
right? I think I would really like, I mean, can I count BTS as like
Yes.
one entity?
Yes,
Okay.
at this point they are.
Okay, yes, so I would definitely have them there.
Yeah.
I think that General Mark Milley would be very, very interesting to kind of just throw in that mix and see what happens. And then for my 6th person, oh man, this is Motley Crue. They're going into music, so I think that maybe, let me see what kind of musician would be really great for that. Tori Amos.
Fantastic answer.
I'd watch it.
Anything Tori Amos is worth
Exactly.
watching. Richard Brune, answer the internet. What's your go-to game plan if the zombie apocalypse hits and you can't say, I'll just die?
Oh, well, there we go. If the zombie apocalypse hits, I'm actually in a pretty good position. We live in a house that's kind of easy to barricade the doors. We would probably shelter in place.
Right.
We've got the ability to do that, and then just kind of see what happens. We know most of our neighbors, so we probably have to see if we could form like a coalition or something.
Right.
You know, if we decided that we did have to move, we'd probably move in a pack because that's how you survive. Especially if you could get in the center of that pack and put like other people around the outside, and then, you know, if the zombies come, they get to them first.
Right. Excellent answer. Rachel, thank you for joining me for Authors Answer the Internet. If you tell us about your book one last time.
Absolutely. So Side Roads is a collection of short fiction. There's some dark fiction, some horror. There's even a literary piece that was published in the Veterans Writing Project Journal.
Oh,
so
fantastic.
All kinds of different things. Check it out, and if you like it, come find me online.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Today I'm here with Stuart Jaffe. Stuart, please introduce yourself and your book.
Hi everybody, I'm Stuart Jaffe. I'm best known for the Max Porter Paranormal Mysteries, but I also have written the Midnight Trilogy, starting with The Waterblade. This is for Falstaff Books, which I'm sure you've done many authors of Falstaff Books. This basically asks the age-old question, or answers the age-old question, what if Agatha Christie had written Lord of the Rings? So it's epic fantasy and mystery brought together. It's a completed trilogy. You won't be George R.R. Martin, and it's a complete trilogy that's a big epic fantasy, but each book is an individual mystery.
Excellent. So I brought you here today to answer 3 questions from the internet.
Sounds good.
Let's start with this first one. Stuart Jaffe, debate the internet. If you could pick a 3-man team, 2 movie characters, 1 real person, to join you in the Hunger Games, who would it be? Two movie characters and 1 real person.
Well, John Wick.
Yeah.
that's a no-brainer.
Smart move.
And you could, there's like, Jason Bourne would be fine, James Bond, any other cool.
Right.
You know who actually, Indiana Jones in his prime.
Yes.
There we go, and what was that? And then a real person?
Yeah.
Does it have to be alive?
No.
Bruce Lee.
Yeah, absolutely.
They may not all get along, but they'll get the job done.
Interesting question for an author.
Okay.
Stuart Jaffe, answer the internet. Would you rather only have internet, which is defined in this question as social media, email, Reddit, etc., but no streaming services? Or would you rather only have TV, movies, or music?
So basically, streaming services or no streaming services? That is a tough one.
Right.
So here's the thing. As an author, the internet is like a lifeline because authors live and work by themselves.
Right.
You know, we're all solitary off in our way, and so we all connect all day long through like Facebook and all that. So it would be sad to give that away. I don't care about the rest of social media. just to be able to connect with, well, I'm connecting with fans, but being able to connect with my peers is really cool. But you know, no music.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of think I'd have to go get rid of the internet, stay with the streaming services, stay with music, and rediscover the joys of snail mail.
Great answer. Stuart, Jaffe, debate the internet.
Okay.
Who is the best fictional cop partner?
Partner.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll go old school and say it's Watson.
Yeah, very good.
'Cause-
Any particular iteration that you like?
They're all, no, just Watson as a character, not anybody's particular version of it, just because the thing about Watson is he's going to glorify me
Yes.
and put me in the best public eye possible. So all my flaws will look cool as well.
Great answer. Stuart, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Can you show us your book one more time?
Yes.
Tell us about it.
The Water Blade. Everywhere. Available everywhere, including audiobook.
Hello.
Darin Kennedy, welcome. Please
Thanks.
introduce yourself and your book.
Hi, I'm Darin Kennedy. I write paranormal thriller, mystery, and contemporary fantasy. And my Pawn Stratagem series, I've been working on literally since 2003. And just a couple weeks ago, the third and final book that I've had in my head since I was 16 years old, and have actively been working on for 19 years, is finally out. And this is the first show here at ConCarolinas 2022 that has been available. And it's so pretty to see all three covers together for the very first time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for coming and answering some questions from the internet. Let me ask you this first one.
Sure, what's up?
Darin Kennedy, answer the internet. How many TV shows that you've seen could you take a college course on and get an A?
About 20.
Good answer. Oh, if you, Darin Kennedy, debate the internet. If you had to choose one movie franchise and one TV series to watch for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
One movie franchise. Gosh.
Yeah.
Man, that one's rough. I'm gonna go with the classic. I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna watch The Lord of the Rings, because I still think that those three original movies are three of the best ever done. And then TV franchise, I want to like make you laugh and say Knight Rider, but that's not actually the case. So it's actually the Dukes of Hazzard.
Perfect.
That's also not true.
Oh, okay. Darin, one final question. Debate the internet. If you could live inside one TV show, which one would it be?
Ooh. I miss this show. I kind of want to go be in the world of Heroes.
Yeah.
Where everybody was becoming superhuman, because I thought that was a pretty cool thing. And I hate that I don't get to watch that anymore.
Yeah.
I think that would be a very interesting place to live.
Great answer. Darin, thank you so much for joining me for Authors Answer the Internet. If you could, introduce your book one last time.
Oh. King's Crisis, the third book in the Pawn Stratagem series, available now on all internet and in-person dealers.
Susan, please introduce yourself and introduce your book.
Right, as he said, I am Susan Wright. I write dark fantasy and horror. I also write all things romance as Shannon Kincaid. The book in my hands is called Armageddon Rising. It is the first installment in my Soul Collector series, which is, let's see, the short version is a bounty hunter for the devil trying to save the world.
Nice. Very cool.
Yes.
So I brought you here today to ask you 3 questions on the internet.
Yay.
And let's begin. Susan, H. Robbie, answer the internet. Would you rather change genders every time you sneeze, or not be able to tell the difference between a donut and a baby?
How are those even?
It's the internet.
What?
It's the internet.
Yeah, it's broken.
This is what happens when you take questions from the internet.
Okay.
Go watch Google search videos on, like, it'll horrify you.
No, that's okay. I have seen what's on Google, and it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I would much rather change genders when I sneeze, Because if I can't tell the difference between a donut and a baby, there is a really good chance for cannibalism, and I am not okay with that.
Excellent answer.
Oh no. If you're laughing like that, I'm scared.
Oh, here's a good one. Susan, please answer that. If you could live anyone's life with anyone's body, who would it be? Just
I'm assuming.
Surprisingly, Lucy Blue had an answer for this.
I'm assuming that staying the way I am because I'm used to this is probably off the table.
Yes. Oh no, you could be you, but live their life. Yeah.
I barely know how to be me. I'm not sure that I could, actually be somebody else and
Would you like another question?
do it appropriately. I'm not really sure how to answer that question without a whole lot of alcohol being involved.
I mean, we can come back and do this in a few hours.
That's a deeply philosophical question.
Oh, okay. Here, we'll replace it with this one.
Asking you shall receive.
Answer the internet. If you had to watch one category of porn for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Okay, what do you think?
Our cameraman was like, what? Though he has an answer.
I'm sure
everyone has an answer.
Okay, every male figure probably has a very easy answer for that.
What do you think it is?
Okay, so you kind of get into the whole double standard of it's okay for guys to do that kind of thing,
Yeah.
Women are like that thing. No, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. So having written romance, erotic romance, some of it straight up literature porn, it's a really good research tool, actually, because when you're writing this, there are arms and limbs and things like that. They can only go in certain places.
Yes.
So, one category. I don't know. See, okay, so watching bondage stuff is really interesting, just to see how you can bend human bodies. So I'd probably have to go with that.
Okay, great answer. Answer the internet. Last one. If you had to get a lip tattoo, and turn your lip, what would it say?
Am I allowed to use bad words on camera?
You can say whatever words you want on this camera.
It would probably say something along the lines of, go fuck yourself.
Fantastic answer. Susan H. Roddy, thank you for joining me for Authors Answer the Internet. Can you tell us about your book one last time before?
Okay, again, Armageddon Rising, book one in the Soul Collector series, Bounty Hunter for the Devil, saving the world, and being very snarky about it. Shit.
This episode, I'm proud to play for you one of the hottest acts in the melodic death metal scene. Orbit Culture is a dynamic four-piece from the wonderful land of Sweden, where they've been drawing more and more attention with their battering arrangements, masterful playing, and razor-sharp vocal delivery, forging a body of work quickly becoming special in its own right. This track, Flight of the Fireflies, is from their 2021 EP, Shaman. Our next act is a composer out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Albatrauss is a chillwave wonder whose album hit me at the right place at the right time during the waning days of the pandemic. This composition, Bliss Essentials, is the first track from their wonderful 2021 self-titled LP. I'm dedicating this track to two of my best friends, Aaron and Daryl. Thank you for always having places in your hearts for me, gentlemen, as you will always have places in mine. Much of this show, this episode, and this entire endeavor would not have happened without you both. For this episode's More segment, I brought three great authors together to discuss with them their distinct views on the topics of character, world building, and voice. These are the foundations of storytelling. I wouldn't have been able to do this if I hadn't been given the opportunity to do so by Alex Matsu and John Hartness granting me the use of a room at ConCarolinas. I want to thank them and the convention for providing me the time and place to make this next segment possible. I would also like to thank my guest JD Blackrose, who joined us later on, as well as Nicole Givens Kurtz and AJ Hartley. Characters form the basis of storytelling. They are the actors, the urges, and the impetus behind the narratives human beings tell. For this first examination, I have brought in a maven in crafting tremendous characters. JD Blackrose is the author of the Sumner's Mark series by Bellbridge Books, and was kind enough to speak with me on her view on how we can better people our stories. So, I'm a big fan of your work. I've been a big fan of your Falstaff work, especially, and I think you have a special strength of building really fascinating, compelling characters that capture readers and make them dive deep into the worlds that you build for them. When it comes to the question of character, what's the first thing that springs into your mind?
Well, for me, I would say most of like 99% of the time, stories start with characters. So I know other people who say no, it starts with plot for them, right? They have a question and it starts with a what if. Like, well, what if there was a baby Yoda who could, and meets up with a Mandalorian? I don't know. What if that? And he sat in this tiny little, floating crib. What if this? For most people, that's where things start. And I have had things start that way. The Soul Wars, which was the very first thing I published, and mostly thanks to you, actually started with a question because I was reading this other person's work and they had this vampire, and the vampire was like the vampire's like mansion and lair was constantly getting shot up. And like it was constantly being destroyed and attacked and all these things were happening. And I thought, what do the neighbors think? Like, what happens when the society lady from the mansion down the street comes up to the vampire's mansion and bangs on the door with her parasol and says, keep it down,
Right.
That's where that started. So it sometimes that does start there, but most of the time it starts with character. Most of the time it starts with this idea of a person. Like, well, I want to write a Monster Hunter mom, but the Monster Hunter that I want to write is a mom of 3.
Jess
she
Friedman.
lives in like suburban Ohio, and she's happily married with these 3 kids. So she's got a whole family to protect. She can't just be out there like all the other monsters, all the other Monster Hunter moms, guns blazing. And oh, by the way, she's a mom of 3, so she doesn't have guns in the house. So what weapons does she use? Oh, She drives a Toyota Sienna minivan. Of course she does. So she's got sports equipment in the back, right? So that's the kind of things I ask myself. And then I'll be like, oh, okay, now that I know who she is, what happens to her? Like, what bad things can I do to her, right? What kind of things can I do? Or the zombie cosmetologist series, A Wrinkle in Crime, this is the series altogether.
Which is a fantastic series.
Oh, thank you. I love it. And I worked really hard on the titles because I wanted them to all sort of represent the fact that this is a zombie who solves murders. Like if Angela Lansbury was a zombie, but he's also a cosmetologist because sure, why not? So like the first one is called Pluck and Cover. The second one is Hide and Chic, then Cut and Dyed and Pros and Cons. And then of course, A Wrinkle and Crime was just too much of a pun for me to resist.
Of course.
But that was a perfect example. I was literally driving to work and I'm thinking, I want to write like a zombie investigator kind of thing. I kept having this scene in my head where there was a body and the chief medical examiner is trying to examine the body and all these cryptids and, all these, creatures come jumping out of the bushes trying to get to the human body, yelling, you don't understand. He really costs an arm and a leg, and like, I just had this idea of that. And so I was like, well, all right, he's a zombie and he solves murders, but like, he can't just be a zombie investigator because that's been done.
Right.
And my Monster Hunter mom is people sort of like her because she's got a little bit of like me in her, like a suburban mom kind of feel. I was like, well, what about me can I put into this character? And I have a very unhealthy relationship with makeup videos. So I was like, cosmetology, right? He's a makeup artist and skincare specialist to the stars in Hollywood. That's who he is. And then I thought, what can I do to him? So the character has to come first. And then I was given the advice once to take my character out to lunch. And basically, just sort of sit at the computer and say, okay, where'd you go to school? Who was your first boyfriend or girlfriend? Or what was your first kiss? Or what's your favorite color? Or what sandwich are you eating? And I'm not eating a sandwich. I'm eating a slice of pizza. Oh, okay. What happened to you when you were 12 or whatever, and sort of just start like pretending I was having this conversation. And then I flesh out my character from all of that. And then afterwards I go, okay, what's like the worst thing I can do to this person? And let's do that. Because that's where you get a book.
So let's focus on Jess Friedman for a second, Monster Hunter Mom. Great character, great stories. When it comes to, you mentioned that there's a little bit of you and her. When it comes to building character, how much do you think is you inhabiting that character versus that character kind of reporting to you? Because, on one hand, I've talked to different authors and they have... There's a real kind of divergence of opinion sometimes that, the character is someone almost separate from them that they're talking to that kind of works through things for them and like they report the story. And then I think there's writers who kind of inhabit their character a little bit. It's almost a little bit like play acting in a way, but in a sense of sinking into that reality. What is it more like for you? Is Jess Friedman separate from you, or do you see enough of you in her that like her voice kind of picked up into your head immediately?
I think that my characters are a reflection of me. I'm not like in them, but learning, for example, Jess Friedman not having guns, right?
Right.
I don't own guns. I've never shot a gun. I am not morally against people owning firearms. I want to be clear. If you want to own a firearm and use it lawfully, that is your right and your business. But I don't and wouldn't and won't write characters that do, because I know nothing about guns because of that. And I would never want to get that wrong because those details do matter. And I picture her as a mom of 3, and I'm thinking she's got 3 young kids. She's not going to have guns in the house. So all the other monster hunters out there all have tons of guns, lots of weapons, right? They name them Big Bertha, they name them names, right? And that's sort of a part of the monster hunter milieu. And I'm like, but my character doesn't have guns and is not going to own them because it's not who she is. I love reading those monster hunter stories. That's great for those characters, but it wasn't right for this one. So how is she going to kill the monsters if she doesn't have those kind of weapons? And so I had to like figure, different answers out for that. The characters in the Summoner's Mark, the main character in the Summoner's Mark, this is the first one, Demon Kiss. Bex and Jess actually are both Jewish because I'm Jewish. And so there's a little bit of write what you know. And one of the things that I found that is really, really interesting is that I didn't know, I guess I had never had an opportunity to voice some of my morals and spiritual beliefs and sort of the code I live by until I put them in Jess and Beck's mouths, and then I was
fascinating.
Like, oh yeah, like that's a core value for me. And it comes out in my characters. that's a deep-seated belief that we are responsible for our actions and, the product of our intent, and our choices are our own. Yes, I believe that. Okay. And Beck says that. She says that in the first book. Um, and, and, um, and people, or maybe that's in Just, I can't even remember what it is. People quote it back to me now that we're the product of our intent and our choices are our own. People like post that on Facebook and stuff. That's the quote that people pick up on. So, and I'm like, yeah, but I didn't even totally know I felt that way until I put it in a character's voice.
So here's you bring up such a wonderful question. When did you finally feel like you had written a character that stuck with you, or a character that you had something here?
Like ever?
Well, it's interesting because I moderated a panel at ConCarolinas that was talking about narrative voice. And one of the questions I asked was, when did you realize that you had found your narrative voice? And I think it was Chuck Gannon, said that he didn't realize he had found his narrative voice until he saw it in the rearview mirror because he was working on something else. And it was just something he realized, like, oh, I can write and I can come up with character. Was there a moment where you realized you had come up with a character? Maybe it was at the beginning of your writing career. Maybe it was, recently with The Summoner's Mark. Was there a character that you found that you suddenly went aha with?
When I realized, like, I love Jess and she's great, but I do think probably with Waylon Jenkins in The Zombie Cosmetologist, because the thing is, when I tell people about Zombie Cosmetologist, it sounds funny and much of it is funny. But what I try to explain to people is there are moments in it, believe it or not, that are very poignant. Waylon's serious problem is that he can't die. He's a zombie. And even if you put him in a blender and spread him over, fling him over the lawn, he will eventually reconstitute and come back. His soul stays there, and hangs around, unable to communicate, unable to move, unable to do anything except watch, until someone comes along and puts him back into a body. And he would reconstitute at some point, some way, somehow, but it would take eons, right? So he's got this friend who started as not a friend because Doc Early is the one who changed him into a zombie at the Battle of Shiloh during the Civil War, and now Waylon keeps him alive. He actually, in the first novella, Sam has to actually like swallow a little bit of zombie flesh once a month to stay alive all this time, because now Sam's mission is to figure out how to kill Waylon.
Right.
It's a pretty serious topic. And there's a moment in the very first novella where Waylon gets held down and he has a true panic attack. He goes through an episode of PTSD because he is being held down. And that's how things happen when he was changed into a zombie. So that was a really good example of creating a character who was very three-dimensional, who felt very real to me. He's a zombie and he's a cosmetologist and he's got all that going on, but he's hiding and just trying to like make it day by day until Sam figures out how to kill him. And it's sad, and I remember writing him and realizing, oh my God, this is sad. I mean, he's a true victim, and the man who victimized him has to fix it, So yeah, so people hear Zombie Cosmetologist and they read the very first sentence because it's an unusual first sentence and they think they know what it's about, and they do in many ways. There's a lot of that humor, but he's a really he's a deep character, much more deep than you might normally think.
Absolutely, I fully agree with that. Those are very psychologically complex stories. Uh, One thing I want to ask: how do you think point of view affects character building for you?
Yeah, I most everything I write is first person. I'm telling it from
Right.
one person's point of view. I am writing a novella right now that's third person, and I
Ah,
don't love it. I'm doing it for a reason.
yeah.
Um, and there are lots of things that are much easier about writing third person because it's much easier. You're not head hopping, right? When you change points of view, you can
Right.
go from, one chapter is this character and one chapter is another character, or you can have a natural break or whatever. And I need to do that in the novella that I'm doing, I'm working on right now. So everything's third person. But you miss that emotional connection with the main character
Hmm.
because you don't hear their most internal thoughts. You don't feel what they're feeling. So a lot of people don't like to write in first person, and I understand it. It's hard because you have to tap into yourself, and it's a little scary. Like it's so much easier to do third person because third person's here,
Right.
right? Third person's away. First person is here, and whether you like it or not, it's here, and that's
Right.
where it comes from. So it's scarier.
So when it comes to creating three-dimensional characters, you've spoken a lot about background, almost having interviews with them, having, an understanding of them, but how much does vulnerability play into creating that sort of three-dimensional character? Because you're speaking a lot about vulnerability in a sense, and I kind of want to hone in on that for a second.
Well,
How does
the perfect
vulnerability
character.
for you play into the creation of um these wonderful peoples that in your stories?
I think that the vulnerability is really important because, well, for many reasons. One, if you have an invulnerable character, it's totally not interesting, right? That's why Superman had to have kryptonite. Um, something has to be able to hurt them. Where it gets interesting is for me
Hmm.
is the psychological vulnerability. Anybody can be hurt physically, right? You could take away a body part, you could take away their arm, you could make it so that they suffer blackouts, or they could do lots of different things. You can do lots of different things for them to them physically, and those are all weaknesses that make them vulnerable. But why is Spider-Man such a fascinating character? Because he's psychologically vulnerable. He wants to protect people. He doesn't want his Aunt May to get hurt, and he doesn't want his best friends to get hurt, right? So, you know, and then again, you've got Batman, who is physically vulnerable, right? He's just a human being. But
Right.
really, what does makes Batman Batman? His trauma.
Right.
So I'm just using these comic book heroes to explain why they're why they've lasted so long. Why have they lasted
Right.
so long? Because they have vulnerabilities that we can understand and identify with, and that make them not perfect, because perfect is just horribly boring and not doesn't make a book, right? It's like, because really the most important thing for characters over a book, what do we always hear? They have to change, right? So they have
Correct.
to, something has to happen from the beginning to the end where they change. They have to be different people at the end. So if you start off with really perfect characters, then you better put, within the very first two chapters or three chapters, you better put a chink in that armor somewhere, or they're going to be exactly the same at the end.
Right. Wonderful answer. So I asked the other guests for this segment of Pondering the Orb kind of personal questions related to their book. And you brought up one that I was going to ask, but I want to ask this in a sensitive way because I know culturally it's difficult because there's such diversity to the Jewish culture. But how do you feel that your Jewish upbringing, your culture, and your faith shaped how you form characters in your work? because Le Guin was a Taoist, and Le Guin, for a lot of her characters, were formed out of her conceptions of Taoism as well as feminism.
Sure.
J.K.
Absolutely.
Rowling formed people from her school chums and, you know, the people that she grew up with. Every character has something, but one thing that kind of, faith is an interesting thing in terms of how we shape our characters. Would you offer any insights into that, please?
Sure. So from the Jewish perspective, I can see the spiritual beliefs in Bex in this new series very easily. You know, where she comes from and how she makes choices, and they come from, you know, a place in me that has been informed by my faith.
Right.
What I needed to do with her is I had to make a deliberate choice at some point, because so she's a summoner. Spoiler alert, a Summoner's Mark series about a summoner. And so she can summon any immortal power with a capital P from any pantheon. And I had this sort of big discussion with myself, because, you know, Judaism's a monotheistic religion, right? And
Right.
and in Judaism, though there is a concept, a sort of very ancient Kabbalistic concept of an underworld, there's no Dante-esque hell. Like, right? Like we don't, there's no hell with a Satan or a Lucifer or whatever. That's a Christian concept. But that concept is used all the time in urban fantasy. And in the end, this is still an urban fantasy series, and I wanted it to resonate with urban fantasy readers, whether they, you know, were Jewish or not. So I was trying to figure out how to handle that, because she's summoning, and at some point she's going to summon a demon. And and this is like a whole topic, while many of the demons that you think of from that are in sort of like, you know, the concept, the more modernistic concept of hell, actually come from ancient Jewish roots.
Right.
It's still like wrapped up now in this concept of a place called hell that Jews just don't have. So I was like, how am I going to do this? You know, how does this work? How do I make these two things jive? And what I realized, and this is the moment of freedom, this is what allowed this trilogy to come into fruition, is I realized that, so she works for other people. Like, she summons things on behalf of clients. So that's sort of her job in the paranormal community. So by the time you get to her, you're desperate, right? You have used every other resource that you can, and now you're coming to her and asking her to summon some kind of power with a P, some kind of immortal, to answer a question or do you a favor. And there's always a price, right? There's always a cost. And I realized that if I just based it on her faith and her religion and what she was grown up with, there would be no book. So what are we going to do? And then I said to myself, it's not based on her beliefs, it's based on the client's beliefs. So if you are a person who believes in a literal hell with demons, then she can summon that for you. And they'll be real because of your belief. If you want to summon an ancestor who appears in the form of a dragon because you come from an Eastern religion where dragons were, a thing, she can do that to you. But you're going to have to provide those swords, those family heirloom swords that are 1,000 years old, because the dragons still want something. So everybody wants something. There's always, if it's a demon, it's going to trade in one thing. If it's a different kind of concept or a different kind of pantheon, it's going to be something else. But there's always a cost, there's always a price, and the onus for that belief is not on her, it's on the client. Right. And once I realized that, I was like, oh, well, now I can use any pantheon, I can use any belief system, I can do anything because it's not about her.
Right.
Right. So
That's fantastic. See,
yeah,
like
it took
that.
that was like a real aha moment for me.
So speaking of kind of building character, you you have this series from Bellbridge, The Summoner's Mark. You've also published extensively in novella and short fiction. What advice can you give new writers when it comes to writing character for the first time? If you could give them one piece of advice or just one thing that you think is kind of integral to starting out, um, what would you say to
I
them?
think it's really important to know. Okay, this is going to sound weird, but I'll give my real answer.
Hit me.
And I'll give it by a example first, and then I'll explain it. When I went to start this Demon Kiss, the first book, the publisher at Bellbridge had said to me she wanted a grittier urban fantasy. Like she'd read the zombie cosmetologist stuff, and she said, I want it like flipped. Like that's 60% humor and 40% gritty. I want it like flipped. I don't want it to be, I want it to be more of a more traditional urban fantasy. And I said, I can do that. Of course, she said to me, but what she originally said to me is, so Joelle, what are you working on? And as you know, this is the moment, right? This is where you are supposed to have three things. This is the rule, right? Whether you're pitching a book or a movie, you're supposed to have three things. The one thing you really want to do and two backups. And I had nothing. I mean, nothing. And I said, well, what are you looking for? And she said, well, that's when I want a gritty urban fantasy. So, and I was like, I can totally do that. But I hadn't been thinking of writing a gritty urban fantasy. I had nothing. And I went to our mutual friend, John Hartness, and I said, guess I'm writing a gritty urban fantasy. He's like, good for you.
Yeah.
Go do it. So I that night I went and I got my phone, and I have a list of things in the notes section. I have multiple notes that are things of, I don't know, an idea that comes to me, a funny line I overheard someone say in the grocery store, something that I might have said that I thought, oh, that would be a great beginning for a book. But I mean, I just have tons of these things. And I started going through them. And I had a line in there that I had said after I had gotten a fortune cookie that said, no one looks good in skinny jeans. And I was wearing skinny jeans at the time. And I turned to my friend, my coworker, and I said, I think I was just fat shamed by a fortune cookie. And he laughed. And I thought, well, that's a good line. And I wrote it down. So I had this in here in this phone for like months. And as I'm going through this, looking for inspiration, I read that line and I wrote, I was fat shamed by a fortune cookie. And then the next line in the conversation, and I didn't even really know who it was between yet, was, did you eat it and show it who's boss? And as soon as I wrote those two lines, I had Bex and her sister. And I knew that that relationship was going to be the crux of the matter, because who else was she going to be striving to protect? And once I had those two lines, I had the thing. I had the little toehold, that I needed. And so my advice is find that character's voice. You don't even have to know what they look like yet. You don't even really have to know what they do. But find something that sounds unique. Look through the notes that you've been taking, and if you haven't been taking notes, take notes. Look through that. Look at the books you love. Read the newspaper. Do all of these things so that you can find a couple sentences, a couple lines, a snippet of a conversation, and sometimes it wouldn't even have to be that. It may be just an image of what they're wearing, but find something that lets you get that toehold. For me, it's always that voice of how do they sound? Are they snarky? Are they passionate? Are they angry? Are they Are they jealous? What is it? And when you get that voice, that's the toehold for everything that'll come next. So I know that is not particularly helpful for some people because it's not like do these 4 bullet pointed things.
Right.
But it is really my best advice. And the best way I think to do that is constantly be listening out for inspiration on voice. Just everywhere you go, somebody's talking. Write down a sentence or two that they said. Write down a little description, because you're going to pull from these later to develop these characters, and you need that voice sometimes to get that first handle on the ladder of who your character is.
Excellent advice. Our final question, I try to always end on a fun one. Who is your favorite character? And this could either be your own or someone else in fiction. And who is your least favorite character? And feel free to expound on why for either of them.
Well, Miracle Max, Billy Crystal's character in The Princess Bride. I know and in the book as well as the movie, because if you haven't read the book, it's different. You actually should read it. It's not totally the same as the movie. But you gotta love Miracle Max. You just do. I mean, and I love how he was played by Billy Crystal, and I love that. Don't rush me, Sonny. You rush me, you rush a miracle man, you get rotten miracles. Which is sort of like a thing I say all the time. Like, don't rush me, you get rotten miracles. So that's definitely one. I also really, really love the character of Charles in the Alpha and Omega series by Patricia Briggs, and the character of Aseel. And I've told her this. I have called Aseel my book boyfriend before. They're just so beautifully done. And one of the things I like about reading Patty's work is that you don't even realize you're reading. I mean, her voice is so natural that the pages just do this. Like, you don't even know. It's great. So I love all of that. As far as characters I don't like, that's tough for me to think of ones that I don't like. I'm not trying to be coy. I'm just really having a hard time thinking about it. Sometimes there are characters who seem to survive everything unscathed. So you were talking about Chuck Gannon. I love Chuck Gannon's books. Okay, it was super fun. But if you go and read the series that first made him famous, the Big Battle in Space one.
Right.
I can't remember. I'm sorry. It's been a bit since I read them.
Oh,
his main character.
It's also late.
Yeah, it's also late. His main character, just seems to be the most clever, perfect guy. I mean, I really enjoy it. Don't get me wrong. I've read the first 3, and I read them I binged them. I read them in a row. But he's never not smart. He's always so smart. And I still love the character. I still like to read the books. I'm still going to continue reading the series. But at some point, he never fails. And since we were just talking about the whole importance of vulnerability, I find that sometimes, I'm just reading it and I'm like, oh, come on. Oh, come on. He speaks fluent French and he can, do complex physics in his head. Really? He knew it all? So sometimes you see that. And as much as I love that series, I really do, and I actually truly do, the complexity of the world building in that series is unbelievable, which is why he was nominated for a Nebula at least twice. But the complexity of the world building is a massive strength, and the plotting is masterful. And every once in a while, I look at his main character and I think, really, he's just that good, So yeah, that's me though, because I like characters who have faults.
Without characters, stories have no movement, but without a world to move in, there is no story. World building is an integral cornerstone of excellent storytelling. Today I've brought Nicole Givens Kurtz, the award-winning author of The Kingdom of Avis and the publisher of Mocha Memoirs Press, onto Pondering the Orb to discuss her approach to creating fascinating worlds not only characters, but readers sink into.
I asked you here because I'm such a huge fan of your series Kingdom of Avis. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Avis, but yeah.
Avis.
Birds. Yeah.
Birds. You created such a rich, wonderful setting that was so different from anything that I had read in fantasy, especially founded in a mystery story around a homicide. And I brought you here today because I really wanted to talk to you about your perspective on world building, not only from a writer's, an author's perspective, but also from an editorial perspective. So, when you think about world building, how do you conceive it when you get started as an author, building your worlds, but also maybe as an editor? Because there may be two different sides to this question. So, by all means.
So, from a writing standpoint, world building takes place, for me, at the beginning. So I might have a character, I always have my protagonist, but but I actually spend time creating what their world is going to look like.
Yes.
And the reason for that, like, how does the currency work? How does the climate work? How does the government work? Because all those things influence behavior, right? They all influence character behavior. And so if you don't have those things figured out, there may be a lot of rewriting involved if you're trying to build it as you go along. But it's really important to know, how does the religions work?
Yes.
Is it, you know, if you look at our own culture and our own everyday, everyone has very different belief systems and different cultures. And the climate influences a lot of how those communities and how those societies developed. And so you think a lot about, when you're looking at world building, all those things. No, it's so tedious. It's so tedious, Nicole. But you need to know that, because if this group of people is from this particular region, their behaviors are going to be different based on how they trade, how they farm, their currency, if they have one, or do they barter. All these things are really important in terms of influence and behavior, especially in fantasy, where you're creating cultures, or you're creating worlds. This also happens in science fiction as well, when you're creating alien cultures and alien worlds.
Absolutely. So, when it came to the Kingdom of Avis, where did the initial where did the initial world of that spring from for you? And were there any interesting developments along the way in creating it?
So I usually write cyberpunk.
Yes.
Mysteries.
Sybil Lewis.
Great
right.
books. Yeah. But I wanted to write something fantastic, but I didn't want to use traditional fantasy characters like elves or dwarves, or I just wanted something different. And since urban fantasy has a lock on werewolves and vampires, I wanted something different. I love birds.
Yeah.
Right. And so I wanted to, so Prentice became a hawk, and hawks have amazing eyesight, so her magical ability is to see the unseen. But I also wanted a matrilineal society, which is what the Order and the Worship of the Phoenix exists in the book. But in addition to that, I really loved The Last Airbender. And so this whole mythical world, right? And then all these different kingdoms, they all have very different specific traits. And it's such a rich, well thought out world building.
Yes, it is.
I wanted to take a stab at something similar. And so, and I remember Aang and them traveling around to all the kingdoms. And so I wanted my protagonist to travel to all these different eggs, which are cities in the Kingdom of Avis, and investigate crimes. And then while she's doing that, she's encountering those different cultures that exist within the kingdom and those different birds.
Well, one thing that I have to compliment you on is not only did you have so many different communities, but you had a real class and economic structure behind it that I found just fascinating. So, when it came to like figuring out class and economics and world building, what did you take into account in terms of creating the space that you ended up putting your characters in, especially Princess, who's such a great character, which, by the way, her powers are amazing, especially the give and take of it. But, and we'll get to the question of magic and world building in a moment. But when it came to class and economics, because the beautiful thing, especially in the first book, there's really a difference between like the rich and the poor.
There's those that live within the egg and follow
Yes.
the goddess's teaching, and then there are those that live in the outer shell, which
Yes.
is the people who don't follow the goddess's teaching and are kind of their own entities. And so they're not good enough to be within the egg or within the city. And so that's kind of that's a dystopian trope, right?
Yes.
You have the elite in the wealth and
Yes.
the resources, and you have those that aren't the elites in these outer parts. So that's kind of where it came from. It's in a fantasy story, but it's a science fiction trope.
Yes.
And so that's kind of where that lives. And there are certain birds that we respect and adore, and there are certain birds that we don't. And so that's the vultures,
Yes.
right? And so you have a lot of that disparity. And in the Kill Three Birds, Prentice isn't wholly aware of it. It's just the way our society works.
Yes.
But as the books progress, she will become more and
Yes.
more sensitive to, okay, maybe this doesn't work.
Yeah. So, when it comes to magic and world building, especially Prentice, there's such an interesting dichotomy when it comes to magic and just the general world you place into it. What's your view on incorporating magic and world building, especially when it comes to fantasy? This show is about epic fantasy and sword and sorcery, but I think in general, a good question to ask, what kind of rules do you give yourself in terms of incorporating magic into a world? Because it's a very difficult thing if done wrong. If done poorly, it can ruin a book, right? But done well, it can actually make an entire series sick.
And so you have to ask yourself as part of that world building. And I teach a class on world building for Speculative Fiction Academy, and we talk a lot about hard magic and soft magic. You need to know that first. Or is your society going to use soft magic, or is your society going to use hard magic, a la Brandon Sanderson? So we use soft magic.
Yeah.
But I also believe that magic has a cost. And and so in many ways, a lot of everything that we do has both a plus and a minus. If abused, it's a minus, right? And so with Princess's powers, being able to see the unseen means you can go in and solve cases like that. Well, she can't have that. There must be a cost to have that kind of power.
And there is a real cost.
And there is a real cost, right, for her. And all hawks.
Yeah.
And they don't have a choice. That's the line they automatically go into because it's a caste system. And so that's part of the reason why her powers work the way they do.
Yes.
Is because magic does have a cost. And that these people are funneled, the birds are all funneled into certain roles based on their abilities.
Absolutely.
Which is, again, it looks on the surface fantastic, but underneath that creates conflict.
Right. So you're also the editor of Mocha Memoirs Press. Mocha Memoirs Press is committed to presenting diverse books to a new global audience.
Yes.
When it comes to the question of diversity in world building, especially today in 2022, when this is being filmed in June, what is going well from your perspective as a publisher, and what is going poorly?
Right, so we do have people who spend a lot of time, like we published a series of Korean dark fantasy books called Hollow Men by Todd Sullivan. Todd Sullivan is a black male who lives in Korea.
Yeah.
And so Todd's lived in Korea and in the Far East. He's been in China. He's lived in those areas for like 10 to 15 years, I believe. And so Todd spends a lot of time immersed in the culture, living within the culture, speaking to people in the culture. He knows the language. So his stories of basically mid-century Korean fantasy, that period, is well thought out and researched.
Yes.
So I don't have a problem taking that story because all his characters have agency. They all are well-rounded. The parts of the story that are South Korean are legitimate and well-researched. No problem. That goes well. I also have, but the other side of that is that we have people who are like, oh, I must be diverse because I want to appeal to more readers.
Right.
And here, let me check all these boxes. But they're basically just Caucasians or Westerners with these wonderful flavors, colors. But they don't have agency. They lack roundness. They're like cardboard cutout characters.
Yes.
And so they're just ticking boxes. And you see some of that in some films. They rush to, you see certain films and certain TV shows that do that really well, like The Dragon Prince.
Yes.
And you see those that do it poorly, and I won't name those.
Thank you for saying Dragon Prince. I think it's one of the most underrated fantasies.
Yes, it is brilliant.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's so good.
So, when it comes to, especially now, you mentioned research. But is there any big faux pas when it comes to world building now that you think writers or authors should avoid, especially if they're coming to MoCA?
Memoirs.
Faux pas. So don't take a culture and make it the basis for your kingdom completely.
Yes.
Yeah, don't do that. And don't make the evil people in your, or the villains or the antagonists be people of color.
Yeah.
Like, don't do that. And if you're not from that representative group, do your research.
Yes.
Talk to people, not just one person, okay? Because we're not a monolith. Talk to multiple people within that. And I strongly suggest you spend time with people in those communities.
Yes.
Because then you get to see the richness and the fullness and the diversity within those groups, and that can enrich your world building as well.
How much? You bring up a really important point. How much can people put together a good setting just by research alone? Like reading books, looking at that, versus actually talking to the people. Do you think talking to people is integral? How much? You bring up a really important point. How much can people put together a good setting just by research alone, like reading books, looking at that, versus actually talking to the people? Do you think talking to the people is integral?
Yeah, it's very integral, and I actually advocate for reading texts written by people of color or queer individuals. And I just got off a panel talking about this, but I need you to examine your why.
Yes.
Why is character A a person of color or trans or queer? Why does this kingdom need to be like China? Or why does this area needs to have this? You need to think and sit with that and be reflective about why are you doing this?
Yes.
Because that'll drive a lot of your intent. It's not an easy thing.
Yeah.
Right? To take a culture that's not yours and learn from it, and try to become enriched by it. That's hard work. That's research. It is not a copy and paste, Control C, Control V type of thing. It's just not.
Yeah.
And I think some people want it to be. Oh, being respectful. Yeah, but see this chunk right here? That's actually not written by the Dene, right? Yeah. That's written by someone else who, right, is observing the Dene. So now but did you go and actually speak to people who were Dene?
Yes.
And ask them about, is it okay for me to use this? And Tony Hillerman, God rest his soul, was a white guy who had a Navajo detective.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And he spent so much time with the Dene, understanding culture. Can I talk about this? What about that? Can you look at this and see if am I getting it right?
Yeah.
You got to talk to people within that, and more than one within that culture that you're trying to borrow from or use. You just have to.
Okay.
And it's work.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's interesting because you brought that up, and I actually sold one of my first stories to you.
Yes.
Yes. And, I tried really hard to be respectful of African history and African culture. When it comes, especially to Black voices, Black stories, do you think that things are better than when you started reading, or do you think there's still a lot more room to go?
So the answer is I think things are better because independent presses have made it better.
Yes.
Right? So there's way more opportunities to get stories, not just me, but there's Milton Davis's MV Media.
Fantastic.
There's like all kinds of, especially in comics, there are a ton of independent comics. They're telling diverse stories. They're telling Black stories. And I like the idea that African Americans can tell the speculative stories that we want to tell and not the ones that gatekeepers think we should be telling. Right. And so that's really important. Is it better? Yes. Do we still have a long way to go? Oh, absolutely, because there's still this idea that there can only be one or two prolific Black people. Okay, you have Nnedi Okorafor and you have Nick A. Jimson, you done. We good. We met quota, we're great. But so there's still much, and if you look at the reports on diversity in publishing, we haven't made strides. We actually have regressed a little bit, especially in kids literature, and all the controversy around book banning. And so we're
Folks,
okay.
we go into this.
Right.
Show
so
itself.
short answer is yes, it's better. Yes, we have far to go.
Excellent. So this is an epic fantasy and sword and sorcery show.
Yep.
I try to ask people big questions about things in the history of our genre. 2022. We're about to have a Lord of the Rings show. and they're trying to add diversity to it in terms of casting. We're having African-American elves, we're having black dwarves, which, you know, textually is actually okayed by Tolkien. Right. But when you look at Middle-earth, which is such an influential setting in fantasy, what do you think are, in 2022, the positives still having Middle-earth being kind of worshipped as it is, and some of the drawbacks to it? Because I see with the Tolkien audience especially, they are so drawn to how the world was shaped in the 30s and the 50s when Tolkien released, so it's very white.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely. Very, very, very male.
Oh, yes.
Do you think that Middle-earth still has a positive influence, or Tolkien still has a positive influence, or do we need to kind of move away from him in epic fantasy and sword and sorcery?
I think Tolkien's story of friendship, so even though it's still very white, the fellowship is still very diverse in its like, there's a dwarf, there's a this, there's a that, there's a this, there's a this. And the idea of this quartet, if I to borrow a phrase from the Dark Tower, on their journey to save this world or to save things, they all work together and they play to their strengths, right? And that message of unity, I think, is still important. That message of, I don't want to do this, but I have to do this, and I'm going to do this because I got the support system. The relationship between Frodo and Sam, I think, is absolutely important.
Yes.
Right? Not only because it's two males in a very supportive relationship that is very giving.
Yes.
And is very non-masculine toxic.
Oh, almost tender.
Right.
Yeah.
It is so needed.
Yeah.
And so I still think that message still applies. And there's so many human stories that take place in Middle-earth that are so important to us still, even today.
Yes.
The relationship between father and sons, the relationship between different cultures and how we meet in the middle, or how we give and how we take, how we compromise for the greater good.
Yes.
Like, I feel like that message is still important.
Absolutely.
And so for Tolkien, yeah, I think those things are still, is it very white? Yeah, it is. But the other messages that are embodied in the Lord of the Rings series is still really integral to who we are today as people.
Right.
So yes, I still think it's integral.
Okay.
Do I still think they need to make room for other stories? Sure. But to answer your question, yes, I do.
So, in terms of what is your favorite world that's been built as a fan? And then for you, you have so many wonderful series now and so many stories. What's the best world that you feel like you feel like you've built?
Favorite world is the Dark Tower series, which you already knew that.
Yeah.
So, Roland and his content will always be my favorite, only because, for many reasons, but I do, in terms of world building, they're never in the same world.
Yes.
And the rotation of there being more worlds than this appealed to me as a reader.
Yes.
And those fantastic worlds were so very different. And that opened my eyes to it not just being this high epic fantasy rooted in medieval Europe, that these hellscapes are also fantastic. This is also fantastic. And that, I love that. So the Dark Tower will probably always be my fantasy / sci-fi series. For me personally right now, of course, I'm in love with Kingdom of Avis, so that's my baby. I love Civil, I love Civil's world, but it's kind of dark. I mean, it's cyberpunk, it's high-tech, low life. And in our current climate, I need something a little bit more refreshing, which is how I ended up writing the Kingdom of Avis to begin with.
Fantastic answer. As a publisher, what are you looking for in terms of world building now in 2022?
Authentic voice and diversity.
Okay. So,
always.
Last question for you for joining me as always. We use that word authenticity a lot, and sometimes it feels like in publishing it gets bastardized a good bit. What does authenticity mean to you?
It does not mean getting it 100% right.
Okay.
And so some people can get hyper-focused, but I got every single detail right in the world building. Yeah, but it doesn't make sense for the work that your characters are doing. It doesn't match up for what the protagonists are doing. And at the beginning of this podcast, we talked about how the whole purpose of your world building is so that you would know how your characters will behave within that world. And if your characters don't match the authentic world that you created, it's going to fall flat.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, because if you're basing it off of, I don't know, 20th, 19th century, whatever, there may be gaps in the historical record that we just don't know.
Yes.
And that's where your role as an author to be creative can come in and do that and fill in those gaps with that creative work. And it's not going to be 100% authentic, but it doesn't have to be.
Story is set, the characters have appeared, ready to march into a vibrant world of wonder. What gives them breath? What gives them drive? What gives them life? My final guest for this segment on storytelling is A.J. Hartley, the New York Times bestselling author of Burning Shakespeare and a distinguished professor of Shakespeare at my alma mater, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He has joined me to speak on the ineffable but binding ingredient to all great storytelling, the narrative voice.
When we talk about narrative voice, or the author's voice, it's often a really hard thing to pin down. What do you think the narrative voice is in your mind in terms of conceiving it?
Well, I mean, obviously when people talk about voice, they often think about character voices and things that work on a sort of a subsectional level within a story. But obviously we're thinking about it as a sort of master narrative technique. And for me, thinking about voice is often very closely related to thinking about genre and age group, right? That if you, I mean, you were just talking about Tolkien. If you were to read a page or a paragraph, actually probably a sentence of Tolkien, and put it next to a sentence from, say, J.K. Rowling, you would immediately know that even though these are both fantasy writers, that they're doing something radically different, right? That obviously with the early J.K. Rowling books, you know, you would feel that sort of middle grade whimsy, the sort of playfulness, the contemporaneity of the thing. And then with Tolkien, you would immediately also get that sense of something a higher form of language, and I don't mean that hierarchically. I mean that high style, right? That epic kind of rhetoric. And you know, Boromir is not going to turn around and say you're a dumbass or something, because you would immediately think, wait, what? What? No, that's not how language in this world works. And I think, you know, that as a sort of microcosm, I think that works across all books, right? So if you're in a bookstore and you're thinking about what you're going to buy, I mean, the first thing I always do, I'll glance at the back, see what the thing's about, and the cover, of course. But at some point, I'm going to read the first paragraph. Yeah. And as you read that first paragraph, if it's competent, you immediately know what kind of a story you're in, right? And so I think that the thing about voice is that it signals where we are and when we are. It tells us what kind of a story we're trying to tell and the way we're going to tell it. Is it going to be, I mean, obviously, I think things like point of view, and is this a first person novel or a third person novel? And if it's a third person novel, is it third person limited or is it third person omniscient or whatever? All of these things become part of voice. Right. But those are the macro things, right? The micro level stuff is about diction and phrasing, sentence length, tonality. What kind of humor are we going to get? You know, you're not going to get a lot of laughs out of Lord of the Rings. Right. Right? And you would know that immediately on reading that one paragraph, right? Yeah. But so yes, this is a long rambling answer, but I think that voice is in some ways one of the things which is hardest to define, but the most important way of anchoring what the story is.
Absolutely. So you've written in so many different genres. I'm a big fan of your book, mystery novel, Masked Patriots.
That's going back a bit.
But I'm also Darwin Arknight, YA, Burning Shakespeare recently. Will Hawthorne. Active Will. When you look at all of these different genres you've worked in, how has your voice changed through the years in your perspective?
Well, hopefully it's better. But I also think that, as you say, it's changed partly because the nature of those projects are radically different. You know, I mean, I was writing mystery thrillers, excuse me, which is, you know, with Mask of Atreus, and I did 3 or 4 of those. And then for various reasons, I decided that I was not going to continue to write those kind of adult thriller sort of things, or at least not for a while. I was going to take a break. And I was going to write a series for my son. Yeah. Because he was then, 7 years old, something like that, and I wanted to sort of, and obviously I was spending a lot of time reading with him, right? So I was aware of the kind of stories that he was reading, and I wanted to sort of contribute to him the kind of thing that I had discovered with something like Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, right? One of those kind of books that made me a reader, you know, and in some ways saved my life as a student, you know.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to do that, and immediately you have to then shelve the kind of voice that you're using in those other books, right?
Yes.
The sense of story that you're trying to tell, the sense of point of view, the sense of whimsy and playfulness that you often have with middle grade kind of stories. And that's all about voice. And it's a tricky thing, you know, that I've seen work by people who were trying to write middle grade, and they had the right kind of story for middle grade, they had the right kind of characters and issues and ideas, but they couldn't get the voice. And it has, it's not like a universal thing, but that sort of Roald Dahl kind of, there's more telling and a little less showing. And it's sort of these are books that are designed to be read to kids at bedtime and things like that, and there's a feel to them. So I think that, you know, when I was working on that series, I had to find a completely different kind of storytelling. But for me, that was about going back to the books that I had read as a kid and to some of the things that we were reading together, like the Harry Potter books and things like that. And then, you know, I moved on as he got older, and I pushed more into YA. I mean, this is a ridiculously autobiographical explanation for my career, but it's true. And because as
journey is very important in terms of the formation of voice. So please.
Right. So as I aged up with him and saw him get excited about different kinds of stories, you know. So then I wanted to write those kind of stories, and writing YA was, again, not just a different kind of voice from middle grade, but then a sort of selection of voices. I mean, you mentioned the Act of Will books. Those are YA, but so is the Steeplejack series that I wrote, and so are the Cathedrals of Glass books and Cold Bath Street. And the voices of those things are all quite different.
Cold Bath Street is a master, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
Now, I mean, as a case in point, that's an interesting one, because for me, that was after writing the Steeplejack series. The Steeplejack series is set in a world that looks kind of like Victorian South Africa, right? So, and it's coming from a perspective of a 17-year-old brown-skinned woman, which I am not. So, you know, that voice was going to be very different from my own, and that's a tricky thing to do. I think, you know, it's a series that maybe I wouldn't write now, even though I'm proud of those books, you know, but the world has changed a little bit, quite a lot. And so when I came out of that series, I wanted to write a book that was still YA, but had a kind of more immediate kind of authenticity, to use the word that you were just using, where I would draw on my own experience very directly. And so it was going to be a book that was not just told from a sort of white male adolescent perspective, but from a white male adolescent perspective growing up in a working class northern English town in the 1970s, right? And I made that decision very consciously.
You're from Birmingham, correct?
I'm from Preston, which is sort of between Manchester and Liverpool, Lancashire. And so I wanted that feel, that sort of some of the dialect, but also just the ethos of the period to be in that book. I wanted it to be a book about what it was like growing up in the late 70s in the UK. And so, you know, it's saturated with music references and what was on TV, because the great thing about the internet is that you can rediscover all this stuff, you know. And all of that, it was a way of then finding my way into the voice of the character and sort of saturating, as if I was going back to my old journals and diaries and stuff, and rediscovering those concerns and what I was interested in at the time, in order to tell, you know, the ghost story, and a ghost story that's really about ghost stories, right? These were the stories that I grew up with. So yeah, again, it's still a YA, but a very different kind of voice. And then something like the Cathedrals of Glass books, which are sort of futuristic. Right. The planet, it's a different planet, but again, they're all teenagers together, and you have to sort of imagine, so how do these people communicate? What are their priorities? What are they interested in? In what ways do they fit into their world? In what ways do they not fit into their world? And all those things shapes the voice, particularly in a first-person novel, obviously.
Yes.
Where everything is mediated, as with the Act of Will books, everything is mediated by character, right? So the reader doesn't experience anything without it going through the mind of the person telling the story.
Absolutely.
So yeah, each of those I think is, you know, slightly different kind of feel. The Act of Will books are a little bit more playful, more snarky, for want of a better word, you know.
So you brought up Cathedral of Glass.
Yeah.
I was going to bring it up a little bit later, but you did these with the former singer of Blink-182, Tom DeLonge. When you, and these are about there's government conspiracies, there's UFOs.
Well, that's we co-wrote.
Right.
Those are the
Sorry, Secret Machines. And then
Secret Machines, and the Cathedrals of Glass books were books that I did by myself, but Tom's company then took those as well.
So when it came to Secret Machines and co-writing with him, when you're working with a co-writer, what considerations do you make for your voice versus their voice?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So I've co-written with two different people, right?
Yes.
With Tom, and with David Hewson, who's a British mystery writer, and I did those Shakespeare adaptations. There's a Macbeth novel and a Hamlet novel. And
both are excellent, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And those were written for audio, for Audible, right?
Right.
They were commissioned originally for Audible, and so voice literally becomes crucially important because that's going to be the dimension in which the story, you know, the audio dimension is going to be the way that those things come across. And David was a very well-established British mystery writer.
Yes.
And he's written a lot of stuff set in Italy. And so what we had to do was figure out how we were going to approach these, you know, well-known stories, reclaim them, make them our own, adapt them, and then sort of divide them up, the things that he was interested in, the things that I was interested in, the character, you know, we would sort of give each other sections, and then we would write I would do, you know, 10 pages and he'd do 10 pages and we'd send them back and forth. We did the whole thing by email and wrote it very, very fast. But then we had to smooth out that voice because we're different people.
Yes.
And find a way to make it feel seamless, you know. And so we had to sort of rigorously, we had to come to a sense of what the thing was supposed to feel like, and then rigorously edit each other to create that sense of a sort of univocal narrative. And it's funny because when the book came out, the first one, the Macbeth, came out, and there was a feature on NPR, and they played a few snippets from it, and I was annoyed because they'd only used David's bits.
Yeah.
I was pissed off.
Yeah.
And then I went back to my notes, and they were actually mine.
Yeah.
But I couldn't hear it. I couldn't because I had sort of forgotten the process, and in fact, these were actually mine that we had then sort of reworked, or mine and his. But I couldn't tell them apart. I still can't. If I go back to that book and look at it, unless I go back to my original drafts and notes and things, I can't tell which parts I wrote and which parts he wrote. Maybe other people can. I can't. Now, when we did the Hamlet next, it was interesting. I was talking about this earlier, and in the meantime, David had been doing some TV writing for, there was a Danish TV show called The Killing, and he was doing some British version of that, and his writing style had changed. And it'd become more contemporary and more punchy and shorter sentences and snappier dialogue. And so when we first started trading off our sections with the Hamlet, there was a gulf between what I was doing, which was closer to what we had done the previous time, and what he was doing now. And so we had to then have a sit down and say, okay, so we have to decide where this is going to be. And we sort of pushed it closer to what he was doing. And then I wrote in a different way. And we then sort of had to smooth that out. Now, all this is a sort of preamble to your original question about working with Tom. And the reason I bring it up is because Tom's not a writer in that sense. So with Tom, the co-writing thing was really him coming to me and saying, I have these ideas, these building blocks of story, and I have this big sort of epic narrative that I want to tell. And basically I want you to write it.
Right.
So we would have loads of meetings and conversations about stuff, and he would send me research and he would send me all sorts of stuff. And then I would write it and send it back to him, and he would go through it and he would give me editorial notes and things and send it back to me. But it was basically my voice all the time. You know,
okay.
so there would be little snippets here and there when he would send me something that he really liked the idea of, and I would find a way to work that in. But I was doing the actual sort of storytelling, and he's always very upfront about that. So, you know, it was a shared project in terms of imagination. The execution was mostly me. After we had come up with the idea of how we were going to tell this big, sprawling, massive 650-page monster, you know, and figure out the architecture of it.
It's a good book, though.
Thank you.
Transitioning away from your career, you're a distinguished professor of Shakespeare. You recently released Burning Shakespeare. When we think of the bard Shakespeare has had such a momentous influence on the Western canon of fiction.
Yeah.
In many ways, Shakespeare's voice is formative to Western canon now. When you were writing Burning Shakespeare, which is a time travel narrative, and you're working with a figure in history that is so outsized in terms of his influence, but you know so much about him. But relative.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Yeah, go on.
But how do you incorporate a voice like Shakespeare's into the modern world? And what kind of considerations did you have to take into really bringing him forward?
Yeah. I mean, this is a book that I have literally been working on for like 25 years. So it has existed in many, many different forms.
Okay.
And it only got published when I sort of came to what the book is now. But it has been many, many different things. It was a YA novel at one point.
Yeah.
It was, you know, characters with different, you know, key elements of the story. The only thing that was really consistent was this premise, the idea of somebody selling his soul in this sort of Faustian deal to literally sell his soul to the devil so he could go back in time and destroy the works of Shakespeare. And then the attempts of this angelic, recently dead human troupe of people who then have to sort of fix it somehow.
Yeah.
And that element stayed the same. But every time I would write it, I would hit a point in the story where I was like, this is not working. It's not good. And frequently the problem was that I was becoming my other self. I was becoming a Shakespeare professor, and I was like, let me tell you some interesting things about Shakespeare. It's like, it's not a novel, you know. It's not. It's now a kind of bloviating, overblown lecture, you know.
Yeah.
Is bloviating a word? I just said that. I was like, what?
Yeah,
anyway. Yeah. So in terms of dealing with Shakespeare himself, sometimes, some points of this history of this book, Shakespeare was more of a character.
Yeah.
And sometimes he's speaking in this sort of bastardized Shakespearean, you know, 16th, early 17th century English. And some of the time, he kind of disappeared. And I think in the version that I actually published in the end, I made the decision to represent Shakespeare himself as little as possible. And because you can only fail, you know? And so I thought, I'll let portions of the plays speak for themselves, and there are lots of little epigrams all the way through the thing. And then there are moments in the story where I'm lifting pieces of text from Shakespeare's plays and putting them in the mouths of characters and rearranging them and rethinking them and using that language, you know, to create a kind of playful echo of the Shakespeare play. But I was really wary of making Shakespeare a character, because as you said, we know a lot about Shakespeare and we know very little about Shakespeare. We
still a very mysterious figure.
We have, you know, all these legal documents connected to him. We can trace his life in many in many ways. We have the evidence of the plays and the poems themselves, but part of what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare is his ability to inhabit lots of different characters in ways that makes the authorial voice disappear. Right?
Fascinating, yes.
Right? So unlike somebody like Marlowe or Ben Jonson, that you know which characters Marlowe likes, you know which characters Ben Jonson thinks are idiots. Because it's clear, right? It's actually quite a novelistic kind of approach to drama, where you feel this sort of editorial presence. Ben Jonson stepping in and saying, this guy's a cretin, right? Obviously. You don't get that with Shakespeare in the same way. We can figure out who the idiots are, but the idiots don't signpost themselves as idiots, right? There's a way that Shakespeare has of imagining himself into these characters and evaporating as an authorial presence, you know? So whether you're talking about a villain or a hero or a minor servant who has a few lines, there's often this hint of backstory, of consciousness, of presence, of thought, as if each one of these characters is being taken seriously and being allowed to give voice to their own position and their own ideas with complete sincerity, right? Whatever we think of them as an audience, you know. And so I kind of thought, well, the consequence of this is that Shakespeare himself becomes a kind of cipher. It becomes sort of impossible to track. What does Shakespeare think about monarchy? What does Shakespeare think about X and Y and Z? Well, we can then argue it, but all these positions get represented by characters who are speaking their position, not speaking his position. You know what I mean?
Fascinating point, yes.
So there's all this sort of, you know, on any given subject, there's all kinds of different responses coming from all the different plays and different characters within those plays that makes Shakespeare himself so difficult to pin down, which is one of the reasons we have people like me, right, who teach this stuff for better or worse. And one of the reasons I think that we're still doing it is because Shakespeare remains essentially mysterious, and part of his disappearing act, for want of a better term, is that the plays are allowed to morph as time passes. So the things, for example, that we would talk about in a Shakespeare class today are radically different from the things that we talked about only 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. Because, you know, to use Hamlet's phrase, the point of drama is to hold us toward the mirror up to nature. And when we look into the mirror of Shakespeare, what we see is ourselves. And we are, and there's enough wiggle room in the plays, there's enough open space in the plays, that we're allowed to sort of extrapolate from them whatever we care about, right? So if I go to the Shakespeare Association conference now and I look at the seminars that are on offer and this stuff on, you know, trans identities and queer theory and race and all sorts of things that would have been inconceivable 50 years ago, you know, and people would never have talked about in the terms that we talk about them today. And so, but this is what we're interested in now. And the plays and Shakespeare himself are flexible enough that we can find in them. This is why I think they keep being productive. I mean, where you can, every time I see a Shakespeare play on stage, I go in thinking, not, are they going to get it right? I go in thinking, show me something I've never seen before. Make me hear this in a different way. That's what I want, right? So when you're writing a novel in which Shakespeare is a character, it's tricky because I don't want to pin him down. So I don't want to over-determine.
And you don't want to pin your voice on his.
Right, exactly. And except, you know, and there are moments where I have him in conversation and there'll be a sort of, and I do this sort of goofy Hitchhiker's Guide thing where I say, this is not how he actually sounds, but it's how he would sound today. And then I can do it all in sort of modern frame. And I'll put a little footnote that says, you know, pretend that you're hearing it through something that transforms, I can't even remember what it says, but it's a Babel fish joke, right? Or TARDIS translator thing. It's the same idea.
Absolutely.
And it's
Universal
an escape.
translator in Star
Right,
Trek.
exactly. It's an escape clause. It's a way of saying, I can't be held responsible for reproducing accurate Elizabethan dialogue in this situation. But it's also a way of not pinning the character down and having instead Shakespeare is this sort of person around whom the story revolves, and all these other characters have the main sort of drive of the narrative, and they are responding to him and about him and so on. But he constantly remains somebody who is sort of listening and observing and thinking, "This, I might be able to use this," you know, but who never really come. And in one version of the story, at one point, it was kind of the opposite, and I was really getting into a sort of fictional biography of Shakespeare and the loss of his son and all this sort of stuff, you know, as being influential on the plays. And in the end, I was like, this is not good. It's not working. And part of that was that what I really wanted was to dial that back and leave Shakespeare enigmatic.
Right.
Because the book ultimately is about what we value and what we hate about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And trying to sort of find ways to decide whether the present is better off with him in it or not.
Well, coming off of that, this will be the last Shakespeare question I ask before we get back to you. In 2022, why do you think Shakespeare remains, especially his voice, remains so attractive and so powerful and so potent? Because, like you said, there's so many different interpretations now, and people are still going back to these plays and trying to find something new out of them.
Yeah.
Why is this voice so integral to us as storytellers? Because I have to tell you, The Tempest is a huge influence upon me. Macbeth was a huge influence upon my writing as a sword and sorcery author. Hamlet. I can talk to so many authors who can tell me a Shakespeare play or something about Shakespeare that still influences them today. And I think a lot of that comes down to, you made a really important point, like his voice kind of disappears and it just becomes the characters.
Yeah. And I think, there are a couple of ways to answer that question. And one of them, of course, is to sort of to talk about the genius of Shakespeare, and he's the greatest writer ever, blah, 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 and this is why these things are permanent. And of course, that, to a certain extent, I think that's true. But there are other, more pragmatic reasons, right? Well, part of the reason we keep coming back to Shakespeare is because he's built into our education system.
Yes.
Right? In ways that none of those other writers from the period are.
Right.
In fact, in certain respects, he defines our education system.
Yes.
He did, right? There was no such thing as the study of English language, literature in the English language, until I think it was Harvard University in the late 19th century decided that they would start quizzing people on books that mattered, beginning with Shakespeare as part of their entrance exam.
Right.
And that's where American high schools started saying, we will now teach Shakespeare as a subject in school, right? And so I think it's really difficult to separate Shakespeare, the writer, and the plays themselves from Shakespeare's cultural legacy,
right?
Which has been, of course, complicated, right?
Yes,
Shakespeare is, for whatever else he is, and we can talk about the genius of Shakespeare and what he has contributed as a writer, but we also know that Shakespeare has been used as a weapon.
Yes.
Right? Particularly, in colonial terms, in matters of race and ethnicity, and in matters of gender and such, things that people chose to like about Shakespeare was used to prove certain kinds of, white patriarchal, straight, ideologies. So all of these things are tied up in what Shakespeare is. So part of the thing that makes Shakespeare so resonant is that he's woven intrinsically into our own cultural history, Right. And one of the things that's fascinating for me as a scholar, but also, in this novel and in my current academic project, I'm doing the Arden edition of Julius Caesar. And I'm trying to build, my sense of the text and everything, which I've been working on for like 5 years, is about sort of rediscovering what Shakespeare was in 1599.
Yeah.
Without all the cultural baggage between 1599 and 2022, and that's a really, really difficult thing, you know, to sort of go back to a time when Shakespeare wasn't considered a genius, wasn't considered a sort of massive literary figure and cultural, you know, whatever, and to sort of try to get back to the sort of Shakespeare as a working playwright and, you know, storyteller.
Fantastic. I have two more questions about you and your voice. When did you, as an author, feel like you had discovered a voice, or the voice that could get you published? I did a panel earlier on character and voice, and I had Chuck Gannon on there, and Chuck had an interesting point where you don't realize you found your voice until later on. Was there a point in your career where you felt like, I discovered my narrative voice, or I discovered my ability to write fiction?
I think there have been points where I felt that. I think I was usually wrong.
Really? Okay.
I mean, in the sense that, for example, you know, you mentioned Mask of Atreus before, which was the first novel I published, right? And as a sort of archaeological thriller and mystery. And so that felt like, finally, you know, this was my, 8th novel or something? My first one to get published, but it was my 8th novel, or maybe more. I had written books before that, which I had submitted and had gone nowhere, and there I had assumed were therefore failures. But one of the books, when we're talking about voice, that people often talk about as something that they like of mine was the Act of Will and Willpower books, which came out in 2011, something like that. So
I remember Bob Salvatore getting a quote for one of the books.
So 6 years after Mask of Atreus.
Yeah.
But that book had been written 20 years earlier.
Wow, okay.
So it was actually one of the first books that I wrote, and it changed very, very little. And the reason that it got published by Tor later, 20 years after they had rejected it, was because the market had changed.
Yeah.
And that, you know, back in when I first submitted it to them, if it was a fantasy novel and didn't have elves and trolls and stuff in it, it wasn't considered fantasy.
Yeah.
And mine had this sort of snarky, conversational kind of tone, you know. And
well, those are very much almost Scott Lynch novels, if you've ever read.
No, I know Scott Lynch. Lancelot Lamore. Yeah, but I'd written them way earlier, and there was no space on the shelves for them.
Right.
So, you know, books that I had rejected or had been rejected, and I was like, well, I guess that didn't work, so I haven't found my voice.
Yeah.
And then after the fact, they published them and said, well, maybe I did find a voice. And not my voice, but a voice. Because as I say, each time I approach a new project, the voice is going to be a little different.
Right.
So a lot of that initial writing is trying to sort of find your way into that to see whether the way you're telling the story matches the story.
Right. Final question. I always try to have authors give advice to younger authors. When you've shepherded actors through productions, you've also written your own work. When it comes to young creatives, whether they're actors or writers, what advice can you give them on voice? If you could narrow it down to a few things, or maybe even one thing, what do you think is important in terms of forming and finding your own voice in the narrative creative space, whether it's books or plays or even television or movies?
I mean, one of the tests I think that a beginning writer can do is that they could take a section of their work and give it to somebody who knew nothing about the book and say, read this page, tell me what kind of a book you're reading.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's very, very simple, and say, well, you know, it's a fantasy novel. Well, what kind of a fantasy novel? Is it an epic fantasy? Is it an urban fantasy? Is it a YA? Is it a middle grade? How dark would you expect this to get? You know, what sort of violence are we going to see in this? Is it going to be very graphic, or is it going to be sort of heroic? Is it going to, you know, I think you should be able to tell that, right? In the same way that if you look at pieces of dialogue, and you should be able to figure out which character is speaking even without the tag, right? Yeah. I think the same thing applies to the overall narrative tone of the entire book. And so, you know, that's a test. How you get there, I think, is a little bit more tricky. And I think that, you know, often in fantasy particularly, we spend a lot of time talking about things like world building and the kind of issues and ideas that we're representing. And I don't know that we talk about sentence level craft enough.
Yes, I fully agree.
Right?
Yes.
And so I think that that kind of work where we say, you know, we're going to focus on just words and phrases, diction. We don't talk enough about diction.
Yes.
You know, it's like, what words are appropriate for this story? And I'm not talking about, you know, adult language or something. That may be one of the concerns. But, you know, how is this thing going to sound? And sound is important. Like I was saying about the audiobooks, when you write something, you should always read it aloud.
Right. So,
always read it aloud and say, where's the music here, and what kind of a song am I singing, or what, you know.
How you brought up a wonderful point, so this will be the last question. When it comes to audio and listening to your voice spoken and read by other people, how has that changed your style of writing in terms of what you consider putting on the page? Because it may not be you actually speaking it one day for the audiobook. Rarely is it the author speaking for the audiobook. I believe you had Alan Cummings for Macbeth.
Yeah.
And he was doing a one-man stage adaptation of Macbeth in New York.
He did the one-man stage after he read our book.
Okay.
He performed our book, and that was part of the decision process that led him to doing a one-man Macbeth. Yeah.
Right. So when you know that your work is going to be read or transcribed by someone else, what kind of considerations have you developed maybe for yourself in terms of like what you do in terms of forming that voice to make sure that like when an audio narrator or even a reader is reading it, they don't get maybe hung up on things that seem normal to you but maybe might catch someone?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I can. And obviously with audio, you don't know who the reader is going to be until, you know, way after the thing has been done. So I think that the trick more than anything is to have other people read it and say, flag anything that sounds too much like me for this particular story. You know, if I'm trying to write from a sort of southern US character and it sounds suspiciously British, then you know, that's going to be an issue. But you know, one of the great things about hearing somebody like Alan Cumming read your stuff, or Richard Armitage, or Noma de Meswene, who did the Steeplejack books, and you know, it's just like it becomes theatrical. Right?
Yes.
And when anything becomes theatrical, it immediately becomes collaborative, even if you're not in the studio working with them. Because there's a point at which you say, okay, I've done my bit, now I hand it over to a competent actor, and you do your thing. And there's something beautiful about that, because now I can sit back and just enjoy it, you know. And sometimes, you know, when I was working with Noma, because Noma was born in Swaziland and raised in South Africa, but she doesn't speak Zulu, which is what a lot of the sort of some of the names and things in the book were based on. And she's like, this is how I would say it. Is that okay? And I was like, yeah.
I would like to finish this episode with a quote from Terence McKenna, noted ethnobiologist and digital shaman. The synecdoche nature of reality, the real secret of magic, is that the world is made of words. And if you know the words the world is made of, you can make whatever you wish. In this episode, I brought together masters of their craft to speak on narrative fiction and how they discovered the way to make their magic. I hope all of us have something to take away from this, that there is a point to all of this. Is there a point to all of this? Let's find the point. Bill Hicks is right. This world is a ride, and in these moments it seems to be a monstrosity of ill design, a frightening cyclone of capital never ending. It is made to whip us about, grind us with force and gravity, and then throw out the remains so the next group can come in. So if the world is a ride, we can build different rides, but what these rides will be will come down to a choice between fear and love. Love will not be found with a candidate, or a grand campaign, or a coup, or wars near or far, or an ecological disaster we cannot escape without many, many suffering. However, love can and will be made by the stories we tell ourselves, each other, and the decisions we form from them. Our world is made of myriad narratives, some more outsized than others, but the root of storytelling spreads wide, setting a foundation upon which people, families, and societies will live upon this earth until they crumble. Our narratives construct the outcomes we will face now and later. In each of us resides characters who are the makeup of not only someone's genetics, but their cultures, their tribulations, and their joys. Their stories, in hindsight, are often clarifying in how and why these characters were able to endure whatever the world placed before them. What I have noticed in these stories is that despite what the world was giving them, the ones who changed it for the better decided to tell a different story than the ones they were living or observing. Everyone is a non-player character until they decide otherwise, and the truth is none of us are playing a game when it comes to ourselves, our families, and our communities, including our global community. Everyone listening to this recording or watching this video has a story worth telling. It may not come in the form of a book, or a film, or some music, but it may come in a piece of the creative spirit given to a child raised in a generation recovering from its generations, or a community coming together through its arts, literature, music, and dance to address deep-seated and widespread grief with purpose and passion their governments refuse to apply. These stories of love, courage, and justice reside in all of us. They are the wellspring of creativity. Even the nihilists had to love something first before it lost meaning to them. This is also a scary time when the stories told in the public sphere herald doom. Doom is a choice. So I would ask you, if you came here interested in learning how to form better narratives and improve your craft, that I insist upon you to do something the moment you walk out the door, close this window, or tap the button on your phone to go someplace else. Do the work to tell the best story you can. Tell your authentic human story. It may not be read, screened, or remembered by many, but you're the character in the most beautiful, terrifying, wonderful, grotesque, fascinating setting that could only be a fantasy if we were not living it every day with its personal tragedies, comedies, horrors, and romances. Find your authentic voice and go forth. You are worthy of this quest simply because it is human to tell stories and make our own. This is not a quest relegated to the chosen few, but to all of us. It is one that resides outside the mere grind of capital, or the pressure of social conformity in its many guises. To seek stories, to seek the shaman, the witch, the trickster, and the healer for ourselves as much as any and everyone else. In telling the story that heals you, you may stumble on the miracle of healing another, even if it is only another. There are no scores kept on the souls we inspire, heal, and help. What matters is the work. Thank you very much for joining me for this episode of Pondering the Orb. Safe and fair journeys.